Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to COMM Week 2021. I'm Dr. Blackwell, here to kick off our next exciting session. So this afternoon, we are continuing our theme, The World is Yours. And the topic of this session is called The Wide World of Sports Journalism. We are going to hear from a couple of really interesting and highly experienced guests in the field of sports journalism. First, we have Mr. Steve Wyche, who's been with the NFL Network since 2008. And after spending most of his career as a print journalist in Miami, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta, he has been at this network where he broke the story of Colin Kaepernick's protest against police brutality by not standing for the national anthem, and has been at the forefront of some of the biggest NFL stories during that span. Wyche serves as a reporter, host, analyst, and writer. He also leads multiple projects on social justice initiatives, the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and the Black College Football Hall of Fame. Wyche also is the co-host of the Huddle and Flow podcast with fellow Howard University alum, Jim Trotter. We also have scheduled to speak to us this afternoon, Mr. Jerome Solomon. Jerome is an award-winning journalist with the Houston Chronicle, having been named the top columnist and the top 10 columnist in the country in Texas by the Associated Press sports editors. He's a Houston native who grew up in Acres Homes, has broad range, having majored in engineering in college and worked as a flight attendant before becoming a writer. He is the creator and producer of the television show Texas Sports Nation and Houston Sports Show, and he's a longtime host on ESPN Radio in Houston. An adoptive father of two preteens, Jerome admits that he is far better equipped to handle billionaire team owners and millionaire athletes and coaches than his lovely daughters. As the moderator this afternoon, we have Irie Harris, a senior here at Prairie View who is majoring in communication and minoring in entrepreneurship. Irie played an important role on the student team that helped to organize this year's COMM Week, and he was directly responsible for identifying and inviting these guests. So I thought it was only right to have him be the moderator of this conversation. So at this time, I'm going to turn things over to Irie.
Thank you, Dr. Blackwell. I appreciate that. Thank you guys for everything. Mr. Wyche is here. There you are.
I'm in the house.
Doing, Mr. Wyche?
I'm doing great, man. How's everybody doing?
Fine. We appreciate you being here with us today. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.
Well, absolutely, man. I'm an HBCU graduate. I've done some projects with some students from Prairie View at the HBCU Battle of the Brains. They won it a couple of years ago. Big fan of what you guys are doing. So, and I love you guys just trying to uplift and rise up. So that's what it's about.
Thank you. We appreciate that. As you know, Prairie View does produce productive people. So we make sure to stand by that motto. I want to piggyback off of the intro Dr. Blackwell presented. I wonder if you be able to tell us a little bit about where you come from, what you do, and how you got there.
Yeah, look, I'm originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Moved to St. Louis kind of late in the elementary school year. So I grew up in the Midwest. Got into journalism. My father was a sales executive at the local NBC station in St. Louis. So I was always around it. And I was terrible at math and science. So I knew I had to do something in the writing realm, because that's what, I always try to play to my strengths. And that's some advice I would give you: play to your strengths. I started out at University of Missouri playing football down there for 2 years. That didn't work out. I transferred to Howard, and to use football vernacular, I lost my stinger. So I just stopped playing football completely. Got into the print journalism field at Howard. Worked at, was the editor of the student newspaper there. Worked at the Washington Post while I was there as well, and that really helped. So my first job was in Richmond, Virginia, where I covered high school sports for about a year and a half. Then I went down to Miami for 9 years and started out covering high school sports and matriculated all the way up to covering the Miami Dolphins and then the Miami Heat. I was a longtime NBA writer, and that's where I met Jerome Solomon, also one of our panelists today. And from there, I went to Washington, D.C. to work for the Washington Post, broke the story of Michael Jordan coming out of retirement to become a part owner and front office exec with the Washington Wizards. And so I was in Washington until 2004, went to Atlanta, began covering the Falcons. Did some big stories there, like the Michael Vick dogfighting investigation. And from there, the NFL Network. So I moved around a lot, covered a lot of bases. But the versatility and the kind of journalistic chops I got while being a print reporter has really helped me grow as a broadcast reporter.
That is quite an answer that I love, and definitely quite of a career, definitely in breaking news stories and everything of that sort. On this journey, though, what do you think would be the most difficult thing about entering the world of sports journalism?
Yeah, it's a weird time. The pandemic has really hit media companies hard. So it's got to be the more you can do, right? Because media companies, especially on the local and regional level, are not trying to spend money. So if you can do your own stand-ups, even on your iPhone, edit them, write the copy, and then somehow get them onto whatever medium it is, be it YouTube, be it for your local news network, whatever, that's going to help you, right? If you're a one-trick pony, if you're just someone who can sit in front of a camera and read copy, you're really going to be limited in today's world, even though you have a lot more outlets than I did. I mean, there's all kind of digital outlets and social media outlets where you can do things, but that's the hard thing, is actually being able to find a slot where there's a veteran reporter or a veteran whatever there, and you're trying to get in. That said, don't let that deter you, because these media companies, because of what happened last summer, because of all of a sudden they have gained a conscience, are trying to hire people of color. So that avenue has really opened things up. It is just a matter of getting recognized. If you just do your schoolwork and stuff like that, people aren't going to find out about you. You have got to raise your hand and DM people like me on Twitter and Instagram and somehow strike up conversations so we can at least introduce you to the right people and leave the rest up to you, because it's an interesting time. It's a tough time, but not the worst time.
Understandable. So do you think you would definitely compare with more of that model of it's not what you know, but who you know?
Yes. Yes. 100%. It's always been like that. I mean, you heard me say when I was at Howard, I worked at the Washington Post, right? So I was in a newsroom with Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon, who some of you may know from ESPN. I was in there with a lot of people, and a lot of really established and world-renowned editors. So when I applied for jobs and had that stuff on my resume and had them as references, and people could call them and vouch for me, I was in. I mean, so that's a very, very important part of things. Like if I recommend somebody, people will say, well, Steve Wyche is really trusted. He's not going to steer us wrong. That counts for something. So it's very important. And then it's what you know. Because if you go there and sham, then I'm done with you. Or whoever refers you is done with you, because you made them look bad. And then you made yourself look bad. And you made your university look bad. Look, we had somebody I vouched for from Howard at the NFL Network a couple of years ago. And the work ethic was not there. Everything else was there except for the work ethic. I had his supervisor tell me, after you let that guy go, like, I'm going to look twice at somebody from Howard again. I'm like, no, you're not. Because, we have a lot of good people, and that was just kind of the outlier. But to hear somebody even speak that way, to even threaten a reference of mine and for my university, which has put so many people in this business in outstanding positions, hey, that was a blow, man. That was a gut punch. And so there's a lot of things you can do besides who you know. Once you get into place, it is what you know, and you have to excel.
Right. That actually did lead me to my next question of asking, as an HBCU grad, how different and how difficult is it as a sports journalist from an HBCU? Is it compared to someone from a PWI?
The difference is the majority of the people doing the hiring went to PWIs, right? So if, say you went to Syracuse University, which has a great communications and broadcast program, well, I mean, the person interviewing you may have gone to Syracuse. So you already have an established bond, right? So there aren't that many people from HBCUs who are shot callers in media newsrooms, in magazine outlets at the top of the food chain. right? So that's the big difference. Now, I will say there's a really good history of some HBCUs, and with any business, of putting people in certain industries, right? From Florida A&M's business school to Prairie View to what. So, you know, when you have outstanding people go shine in a realm, they're going to be like, hey, can you find us someone else from Prairie View? It so happens that the communications department at Howard University has, you know, Frederica Whitfield from CNN on weekends, Stan Verrett, Sports Center anchor, who graduated with me from Howard, and Gus Johnson, who calls games, you know, on Fox Sports. So we all graduated together. So we can always use that. And Michelle Miller, who does CBS Morning News, we can all say, this is our group. This is what Howard produces. This is how we do. And people be like, okay. So that's going to get your attention. So there's that part of it. It's not so much the people, though, coming through the pipeline. It's the people doing the hiring that differentiates PWIs versus HBCUs.
Understandable. It is towards the end of March this year. I want to go back a little bit to last March when the whole world was affected tremendously by COVID-19. And now we're still in this pandemic. Can you talk about the beginning of the pandemic and how COVID impacted your work as a sports journalist?
Yeah, I mean, look, it impacted all of us because we're doing this, right? This time last year, we're all trying to figure out how to do Zooms and StreamYards and everything else, right? And now we've got that part mastered. But what it did for a lot of us is, you know, we just couldn't be where we needed to be, right? I couldn't be at an NFL stadium, or I couldn't go interview somebody in person. It had to be established like this. So you're not having that human connection. And for reporters like me to be able to look at somebody in the eye or to sit by them, where my interviewing style is very disarming, right? I may be asking a very personal or a very tough question, but I'm asking it in this tone of voice like we're just having a conversation. That doesn't necessarily always come through a Zoom or a StreamYard or whatever. So that's been the really tough part. So the lack of access, the lack of traveling, getting viewers to get used to watching us shoot interviews or do reports from laptops or from iPhones. And we all have done that. I mean, that's been the big adjustment. So now there's no excuses not to get a story because we can always find someone on Skype or whatever on the phone or Zoom on a phone. So that a lot of what's happening in that realm is going to continue once things begin to open up.
I surely hope it does too. Do you believe there is a lack of Black journalists in your field? If so, why?
Yes. Especially Black women. Look, I can go to a press box, and I do this every year when it's like the NFC or the AFC championship game, right? Where there's 180 members, 200 people in a press box. And I'll just kind of do a panoramic shot. There may be 6 or 7 Black journalists. And, look, a lot of it is when TV networks began to cut back, and especially newspapers began to disappear, we were the first and most heavily affected because, there are a greater number, I say, of Black print journalists and maybe Black people in or even people of color in the broadcast realm, right? So when it came time to chop this type of writer, and then all of a sudden the newspapers were meshing NFL and NBA writers, well, they may take the veteran white writer and then the Black writer who'd been kind of the sidebar person, or the NBA reporter, which isn't as big. Let's say in New Orleans, right, where the Pelicans aren't as big as the Saints, that person may have gotten waxed. So that's part of it. The other part of it is, even at the NFL Network, right, if we have 35 executive vice presidents, 0 of color, Otis, right? So to get those people to hire people of color, right? If you turn on a sports network, ESPN and this and that, you're going to see a lot of Black former players, men and women, or former players of color. But you aren't necessarily going to see a lot of trained journalists of color. And a lot of that isn't because we're not here. It's because the people doing the hiring don't know where to find us, or at least use it as an excuse, or they're just more comfortable hiring people from the Syracuses or the Harvards or something like that because that's how they came up. That's how they know. Those are the fraternities and sororities that they went to. So that's the big bridge that must be built, is getting more people like us into the management corridor and in the hiring process, so we can reach down and say, no, this person from Prairie View is for real. I know their professor. That professor trained me. I trust their word. I'm going to give this person a shot. And that's the biggest hurdle to overcome in this industry.
What specific tips would you give to Black journalists who are trying to get into the industry?
First off, know your stuff. Know your stuff. So many times people have been like, hey, I want to do this, I want to do that. And I'll ask them for a reel. I didn't know I was supposed to have one. You're done. Right? Okay. Or what type of internships have you had? And this is where I feel bad for people in school right now, because COVID has killed internships. Right? A lot of these media companies, whatever you want to work for, they don't have the money for them. You couldn't get to a certain city to take part in them. You just didn't have access because COVID shut all that down. So that's just really going to affect a lot of folks in terms of having internships. But internships are where you get to know people and meet people who can reference for you, right? And you get that hands-on experience. Because to me, when I first went into my first newsroom in Richmond, Virginia, 23 years old, Howard really pushed me, right? But I never had to work in an environment where I've got a 65-year-old guy with health issues, a 45-year-old dude going through a divorce, and things like that. So these are things that you're not expecting and you can't prepare for. But the best advice, again, is to get some type of work experience outside of your university, because guess what? The 500 other people who've applied for your job, the majority of them have that. Right? You have got to stand out, and you've got to fully understand that for every job opening, there are hundreds of people who are applying for that job. You have to distinguish yourself. Even if that's shooting YouTube videos or doing things like that, where you may have a certain look, or writing stories on your own blog. Show them deadline stories or feature stories, not just commentary stories, where they can say, well, okay, you've got a nice touch here. We can work with this. Anything you can do to distinguish yourself is the most important thing. And then you've got to make those connections. And again, it's as simple as doing what you guys did, reaching out to me to appear on this, or to DM me or other people like me, the Michael Wilbons of the world, the Kimberly Martins of the world. We'll help you. I mentor dozens of people, and I've recommended some of them for positions, which they've gotten. So that's a huge part of this.
Definitely. I wanted to go into more of your career. I know you mentioned earlier of your accomplishments and being able to break stories, certain periods of your life. I wanted to talk about the moment that you broke the story with Colin Kaepernick. Can you describe that moment? And did you expect that type of response?
I knew it was going to be a big story, because when I used to cover the NBA, there was a player named Chris Jackson, right? He went to LSU, then played basketball for the Denver Nuggets, converted to Islam, and changed his name to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. So back when I covered the NBA, he stood for the national anthem, but he would always hold his head down. He wouldn't recognize the flag because the NBA had an anthem policy. You players had to stand for it. So when someone asked for him why he's not recognizing the flag, he said, look, as part of my religion, I'm not going to recognize a flag that thinks it's okay for people to brutalize black people and to treat them a certain way. Many of the same things that Colin Kaepernick said. So I got a phone call. It was a preseason game, 5:30 p.m. on the West Coast. I was at the game, no camera or anything, because Colin Kaepernick had gone through a bunch of surgical procedures. This is the first time he was medically cleared to play under the new coach, Chip Kelly, who was supposed to run an offense that was going to showcase Cap skills and get him back to the Super Bowl quarterback he once was. So one of my colleagues said, hey, I was speaking with somebody with the Niners earlier who said Cap has not been standing for the national anthem the previous two games, but since he hasn't been in uniform, we don't know if there's anything to it. Well, that immediately triggered something. That summer, I've been watching Cap's IG, Twitter account. He was really finding his voice on a lot of Black Lives Matter issues. Remember, 2016 was just like last year. You had Eric Garner choked out by police in New York, Alton Sterling getting shot by police in a parking lot on video in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You had all of these things going on. It was a presidential primary between Hillary and Trump. The temperature of the nation was accelerated, right? So when I found out Cap wasn't standing for the national anthem, I'm like, this might be bigger than him just maybe sitting down and tying his shoe. So he doesn't stand up. I've got a whole game now to process this because I can't talk to Cap till after the game. So I alerted my editors, like, hey, we might have something here. I had a previous relationship with Cat. So when he came off the field and nobody asked him about this in the open forum, I pulled him to the side. We spoke about it. He told me, he said what he had to say. And because of everything I knew he was standing for, the climate of the country, I was able to say, if you look at the lead of the story this day, it's not that Colin Kaepernick did not stand for the national anthem, which is how a lot of people interpret it. It was Colin Kaepernick did not stand for the national anthem in protest of police brutality against people of color in the United States. Plain and simple. No one had to ask or read anymore. This is what he did and why he did it. But of course, it got misinterpreted and twisted, because anytime you trample on the flag, it's going to offend a lot of people. So I knew it was going to be big. I figured it would have legs, not like the legs it continues to have. And at the time, the NFL was not ready for this, because a lot of team owners and people chose their sponsors and fans and how they would react, as opposed to addressing the issues of social injustice and judicial inequality.
Mr. Solomon.
Good afternoon,
Jerome.
gentlemen. I apologize. I won't waste time with all of the backstory for this, but it's been a bit of an adventure today. It's one of those things we learn in journalism, as Steve can tell you. We deal with what we deal with, you know.
Be nimble.
Well, as the coaches always say, control what you can control. Is like, but I need to control some other things, coach.
Well, it's okay. We appreciate you coming, better late than never. Me and Mr. Wyche just have been having a good conversation, asking some questions. I'll ask a couple of the same questions to you, but since you just joined along, I do want to start off and ask where you're from. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got there.
All right. Well, I'll try to make it short, even though I have a long story. I act like I'm not as old as Steve is, but, I
couldn't tell at all.
Hey, I look good for my age. What can I say? I'm from Houston, born and raised. This is my town, my city. And I grew up in the hood, as it were, in Acres Homes, the Fofo. People know that very well. And I was always a math guy in school and just excelled in math, was taking, testing college level math when I was in elementary school. So it's like, hey, every counselor I ever ran into was like, well, you should be an engineer because you're a math guy. So, of course, I went to college and majored in engineering. And that was the most boring thing I could imagine doing for a living. So I worked in engineering, worked for an engineering firm, and was not happy, was not working for me. And I just quit and became a flight attendant so I could travel the world and see what was going on. I know Steve's, your wife was a flight attendant. I remember we've talked about that before, and it was just great for me, but that wasn't as fulfilling. It wasn't as, using what my abilities were, I don't think. Went back to school at the University of Houston, and a professor said, man, your writing is really good. Why don't you explore that? And I was like, well, because no one's ever told me my writing was any good. I'm a math guy. I'm not a writer. I'm not a wordsman. Sent out a couple of queries to magazines and wrote a couple of magazine articles. The Chronicle got wind of it. My hometown newspaper asked me to send them a story about a high school football team here, Booker T. Washington. I wrote this beautiful, ridiculous 2,500 word piece on the football squad mid-season. And they're like, we can use that. And next thing you know, I started covering high schools, freelancing for the paper, turned that into being hired by the paper, and moved on to covering colleges, the Big 12, left the Chronicle to go to Boston Globe for a couple of years to cover the NFL, came back to the Chronicle as a columnist, and I've been doing that now for 12 years or so. And I still have never taken a journalism class, still learning how to be a better journalist, as we all should be learning anyway. But I certainly came about it in a roundabout route to where I am now. And now I own a couple of TV shows. I work on television. The Chronicle has a show. that I'm on. I have a couple of other shows that are on AT&T Sportsnet and a local station here. So I'm doing television. I own a radio show that I'm on weekly, and I've done radio host, etc. So it's a little busy world. I can do a little bit of everything. People say I do some of those things well, but more importantly, I love what I do. It's a lot of fun.
Beautiful. What it sounds like is this career in sports journalism pretty much came out of nowhere off of word of mouth, and you'd go and do your thing, and then boom.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I mean, obviously, I'm sure Steve will tell you too. One of the things that I tell people about what I get to do for a living when I'm watching a game, I'm working. And on top of that, obviously, I get to go to the games and I get to interview people and be around them. And I've traveled the world because I've covered the Olympics in China and London and Greece, all over the place. So you get to see people at their highest high and lowest low. But there are a lot of hardcore sports fans who follow sports, like I do. But that's a hobby for them. For me, it was my hobby anyway, and now it's what I do for a living on top of it. I can't imagine a better job than being able to cover what I cover, to be at all of these sporting events, but more importantly, to tell the stories. I mean, I just love telling stories, and there are no better stories to me than sports stories because, as I said, you catch people on their highest high or their lowest low, and from the time I covered high school sports to now, where it's allegedly so much bigger, I can tell you one thing. When my editor at the time asked me to move from covering high schools to covering the Big 12 conference, I was so naive in the business. I didn't know that was a promotion. I was like, okay, I guess if that's what you want me to do. I didn't realize it was a life-changing type of thing, because to me, I was covering the big time. I was covering state championships. I was covering sports. I was in the paper. I was on the front page, A1 stories and front page of the sports section. Didn't matter to me that I wasn't covering a professional team or a college team. I was just writing stories about people. And to this day, kids, they're not kids anymore, but kids I covered in high school reach out to me all the time to talk about that story I wrote about them. And it's a very fulfilling situation then.
I'm sure that's a beautiful feeling. Within your work and the great things that you have experienced, things have definitely changed over the last year or so, being in the pandemic, being affected by COVID-19. How has COVID impacted your work as a sports journalist?
Man, it's been difficult because my one strength is my ability to relate to athletes and coaches and general managers, owners even, on a personal level, and just haven't been able to do that. I mean, my standard for working a locker room, as it were, at an NFL game or practices during the week, or every day at an NBA during the week, or the clubhouse at a major league game, is the crowd, the gangbang, as we call it, of media will circle around a guy to ask questions. I'm usually over in the corner talking to an individual player off to the side, working that player, getting to know them personally, getting to understand what's important to them, and getting an understanding of what the team is all about. And man, this year, and I haven't been able to do that. I haven't been in a locker room. I haven't been around a team. I mean, one of the reasons I was a little late today is because the University of Houston made it to the Final Four for the first time since 1984 last night. Yeah. And I know some of the players. I've talked to them on the phone or on a Zoom, but it's not like a regular season where, if this was a couple of years ago, I would know those guys. I would know their parents because I would be at the games and talk to their parents in the stands and get a better feel for their family, their little brothers and sisters or older brothers and sisters, whatever the case may be. I have none of that now. So I don't have quite that connection to quite get behind the story as it normally would, because of this pandemic it's built a wall. As effective as Zoom is in terms of the ability to still communicate, it's not the same as talking to someone face to face.
It's not the same as being in front of them, feeling their energy, hearing the tone in their voice, face to face, the whole environment, everything of that sort that helps make a great story in your type of work. I definitely understand that.
Yeah, no, and for me in the kind of writing that I like to do, I need that story behind the story. I need a player to talk about things that he won't say when the microphone is in his face and the cameras are on and he's giving you all the cliched answers. I need him to give me the real, as we say, you know what I mean? And you can't get the real. Well, it's more difficult to get the real over the phone or over a Zoom than it is face to face, because they can see you, feel your energy, and respond to it. I've been able, I've done my best to do it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I still have to do the job, but boy, it is not close to being, the deep level of, communication that you normally would have.
Working for the Houston Chronicle, one of the largest newspaper companies nationwide, we also live in a world driven by technology. Do you see the newspaper industry declining or maybe prevailing?
Prevailing, yes. I don't think that your question, I don't think there's an or.
Okay.
Yes, the newspaper is declining, but also prevailing. So it's not an or, it's an and, because we do so many more things. Like I said, the Chronicle has a television show that I'm the host of, and that's a totally different medium than the newspaper. And I do something totally different there than I do in the paper. So we're in the communication business, we're in the storytelling business, and it can expand and grow from there. And of course, still, it's the Chronicle. So we have the biggest website in Houston. There are people email me every day who read the paper every day. Of course, that demographic is an older demographic than the younger group, and the newspapers were pretty slow in trying to figure out how to reach that next generation. I just know when I left home to go to college, right after you got your lights, your phone, the water and gas, if that were the case, and all the utilities, you got a newspaper subscription. The world has changed. That doesn't exist anymore. I went to school at University of Texas in Austin, 3 hours away, and I would get the Houston Chronicle every day delivered at my apartment or my dorm room, whatever, when I was in school. Can't get that anymore, because now we don't deliver statewide like we used to. So that's it. And I'm bothered by that. I'm like, man, wait a minute. We want to have them to have the paper, but they don't need the actual paper to read the paper. That's what the digital age has taken us somewhere else. And newspapers have been a little slow in learning how to deal with it, and they're still confused by it. But the journalism doesn't change, but the newspaper business is still huge. It's just not a paper business necessarily.
Irie, can I jump on something that Jerome just said that I think is important for all the people on this call to understand? When Jerome was talking about great stories, and there's so many rabid sports fans and things like this, one of the greatest sports editors of all time was someone I worked for named George Solomon at the Washington Post. He said, never underestimate the IQ of the sports fan, because what is the one thing that an 8th grade dropout can talk about with someone who has 5 degrees from Harvard? Sports. So you can never underestimate. That's why if someone doesn't know their stuff and tries to kind of front on a story or act like they know, they will be called out in a heartbeat, because sports fans are some of the savviest and smartest in the world, even though they may not have that great formal education. So I think with Jerome pointing that out really emphasizes that point. In what we do, we have to be on our P's and Q's, and you can't BS anyone, because the posers will be exposed.
Without question. I mean, people, it's what drives our industry. There are people who their lives are wrapped up around their sports fandom. They know more about the team than I do on many levels because they are reading everybody, they're in tune to it, etc., and they're working their own job somewhere else. So I can't come at them with something that makes no sense because they're like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. You know? You're not on top of things. And so I need to know everything from all the sports across the board on some level, or I need to know, but it's more important that I'm honest and like, this is what I do know. This is, I know I can get stuff that you don't know, so I'm going to present that. But if I was out there just trying to, you know, and radio guys do it, and I'm not slamming radio guys, but they'll just say stuff because they're saying it without some background to it. I can't do that because you say something on the air on radio, it goes off into the air. You know, I put it in print. I go into archives all the time now.
Receipts are there, Jerome.
It doesn't get away, you know.
Awesome there. What do you both feel about an aspiring sports journalist going to graduate school? Would you recommend it, or would you say that they should go into the work world?
Jerome, since you had the adventurous career, I'm gonna let you start with this one.
See, my advice on that one is probably going to be a bad advice, but a great point, I think, from me. Okay. Do what works for you. There's no blueprint. There's no right way to do it. As I said, I've never taken a journalism class, and now where I am, I've gotten to where I am, and I'm like, man, it would kind of been cool to major in journalism. Because good friends of mine worked at the school newspaper and, you know, wrote for the college paper and got masters in English and journalism and knew so much more about it going right into the business than I did. But I didn't let that stop me. I didn't let that prevent me from bringing what I brought to the table. And my bosses throughout the time I've been in the business have all said, you don't write like you were taught to do this. You're real. And they're not slamming the other, you know, the traditional journalists by saying they're not real, but I can't follow the journalism rules because I didn't know them all. I've learned them over the course of time. But yeah, if you're a person who you think you want to go to graduate school and you will benefit from it, do that. That won't hurt you at all. But if you're one like, I need to get out there and get it and start grinding right now, do that. It's very much a personal choice.
It really is. Because, you know, like with me, I worked 20 hours a week at the Washington Post while being the student editor of the student newspaper and graduating. I didn't want to take another class. I was ready, right? I wanted on-the-job training, but I was also, I think, mentally mature to handle everything that came. Not everyone is ready to deal with the grind of the real world because they've been in an academic structure, and maybe they need that extra 18 months or 2 years to get a master's degree. Or it depends on your university. A lot of universities may have mass comm degrees, but they don't necessarily have anything as pointed as television production or something like that. So that's where a grad school can really help you. I mean, a lot of it just depends on what your university has, where you are in your own headspace. I mean, I was ready to go get it. And I had the means, again, the avenues to get there right after graduation. A lot of people, if they don't have an opportunity to get a job, maybe grad school someplace where they can make the, you know, let's say you go to a school in a small town, you go to grad school in Chicago or Nashville or someplace like that, where you can make certain connections that can get you into the pipeline that's there. So it's an individual choice. It's what you want to do and just how prepared you are to take things on, such as paying your own bills and dealing with people who don't really care about you like a professor might.
And one other add-on to that also is the world of journalism is changing so quickly. I mean, what you do now is so different than what we were doing 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 15 years ago. So I'm not even sure that the grad schools are as on top of it
Right. It's a good point.
Someone who is already in there working it. You know, if you get a graduate student who just walked out of, you know, getting that master's versus someone who's been, as Steve said, started working while he was already in school and has been there for 3 or 4 years while that other person was in grad school, I think the one that was working might be ahead. You know, it's very much an individual thing about what they're about. But boy, it's good to have that label on you, you know, that flag you can wave that I have a master's. But it's like the NFL draft. You can be, hey, I started at Michigan as quarterback. And they're like, so we want this guy from North Dakota State. You know, it doesn't matter.
Hey,
what do you bring to the table?
Angie may be $50,000 more in debt.
That's certainly a factor.
Understandable. I have just one last question before we move on to the Q&A. I just enjoyed sitting here listening to great answers and perspectives from the both of y'all. To end off this part of it, I want to ask, in your opinion, what does the future of sports journalism look like?
Were we supposed to be psychic?
Yeah, I mean, I will say this in the short term, right? Because of COVID, a lot of these teams and leagues got to a place where they wanted to be 10 years ago, such as not having us in locker rooms post game, not always having us at their facilities after practices and whatnot. I do think you're going to see some version of that, at least in the short term. Like next season, I may not be able to get into an NFL locker room after practice or after a game under the guise of we're still getting through this COVID stuff. Right. So what they may do is still bring players out to us and coaches out to us face to face, but we might be 10 feet away, 6 feet away, whatever it is. So I think some of the restrictions that came into place are now going to be an apt reason for these leagues and teams to try to keep the media away at arm's length a little bit more. And Jerome, and I want you to point to this because you said you own, you know, some of your own production companies and things like that. Because also what we're seeing, and it started with Russell Wilson and Derek Jeter and a couple of guys, is athletes really putting things out on their own, whether it's the Players Tribune, whether it's through Twitter and Instagram and things like that. So a lot of them are controlling their own narratives, so to speak, by doing it that way as well. That, to me, is kind of the biggest – I don't need people to tell my stories when I can tell my own. Well, those are going to be one-sided, of course. Right. But yeah, that's more of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a significant point. But it's also even within the and this is from, you know, Steve and our vantage point of we want more access, and we can see already that the leagues and teams will be like, hey, we don't have to give them that access. Right. Well, the one huge difference in now versus when they wanted to do that 15, 20 years ago is, well, now we have much more access directly to athletes than we've ever had before. I mean, we're used to be able, we were covering colleges or whatever, and people did with the pros too. You could look up the mother and father's phone numbers and contact them and work your way around to the athlete. Now you can DM them. You know, you can follow them on Twitter or Instagram and connect with them directly there without going through the team. And I've done many interviews with athletes that had nothing to do with the media relations department at the school or the team or the franchise. And so as they try to push the media away, you just have to be, you know, go about it a little different way. It's a different kind of work. It's a different situation, but you still, as Steve and I said, you're trying to tell a story. And most of the time, as much as there's some, you know, combativeness there, the teams want you to tell great stories. They want that, but they don't want you to tell the bad stories. You know, they almost don't even want you to write about a loss. like, well, wait a minute. It's not my fault you lost. you could have won. You did. I mean, I was going to write a story regardless, but it is much more of a challenge than it has been. But going forward, we're going to see a lot of more of people reaching out directly to athletes, getting those same stories, just going about it a different way.
But when you do that, you got to have credibility, right? So like Jalen Ramsey, who the corner defensive back for the Rams, is not a big media guy. And We put in all kind of media, interview requests for him. No. I hit him up, DM. Jalen, I want you to come on my podcast.
What you need?
This and that.
Because that's who you are. Right. Exactly.
Credibility matters. And look, guys, and us as Black folks, a lot of times we're kept on the fringes, but this is a way we can connect with the Black athlete or with the Black coach. So don't be afraid in that regard either.
Oh no, and those shared experiences are valuable and pay off for you. But like you said with Steve, like people often will go, "Oh, he got that story because he's Black." It's like, well, wait a minute.
So
the white guy get the same story. He didn't get it because he was white. Like it's an unfair playing field in that sense. But man, especially for the audience that we're dealing with here today, the younger journalists, people trying to get into it, don't ever be ashamed of who you are and where you're from and your particular connection to an athlete that might pay off for you, because you're from that generation. I know when I got into this, I was younger and I was like, hey, I see these people in places where I am. I'm not chasing them as a journalist. I relate to them on a different level. I relate to them because, we have shared experiences. We're from neighborhoods that are a little bit alike. And now I relate to their parents. And their parents reach out to me and go, man, you really told my son the story well, or you told my daughter's story well, and I can relate to that. And it means something to them. So I would be, dishonoring my position to hide from that.
Definitely great answers there. Now we start off our Q&A. The first Q received is, has working in sports journalism affected your ability to enjoy sports as a fan?
Oh, yes.
Can I take that one?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Because you distance yourself so far from it, because you have to be unbiased. And I do think in the last 20 years, there's been a change of people being much more willing to say I'm a fan of something and still be a journalist. I can't do that. I taught myself not to be that way and not to do it. You can say, well, kind of easier in Houston. Ain't nobody won nothing around here for a long time. But every now and then, like U of H last night gets to the Final Four. How the hell am I not going to act like I didn't grow up on U of H basketball, that I didn't worship Guy Lewis and Phi Slamma Jamma and those guys? Like, I wouldn't be honest if I didn't go, U of H means something to me. It's where I went to school. It's my city's team. And it's great to see them back where they are. Doesn't mean I'm not going to slam them if they get smoked in a game or anything. But no, but the joy is not the same because I'm in the stadium. Yeah, real quick. One of the things that I tell people, I've gotten from some people before about the Texans, like the Texans don't matter because they came much later in my life. But I've gotten people saying, man, you write so mean about it. It's like you take it personally. I'm like, well, yeah, I kind of am, because I have to go to the game. I have to be there for every Sunday. How bad the team is, and I'm still, I can't change the channel like a fan can. So in some ways, not being a fan doesn't matter. I'm at the game every week, so I want I root for me more than I root for the team. I want an exciting game. I want the Texans to go 16-0 and win every game in overtime, or go 0-16 and lose every game in overtime.
No, you don't.
8-8 does me no good. You know I would write a book if they went 0-16 and lost every game in overtime. It's the story.
But here's the other thing. It's not that, okay, as a fan, like, I love watching the NFL and I love watching the NBA and I love watching a good Major League Baseball game, and I love English Premier League soccer, right? But in terms of like a rooting interest, absolutely not. I mean, the only team I really root for is the St. Louis Baseball Cardinals, right? Because I've never covered Major League Baseball. That's a team I grew up watching. But when I cover an NFL game, I'm not taking it from any type of I really want this team to win because their players are better interviews. Whatever angle, I've got no rooting interest because so many of the people that you may come up covering, they're on different teams now. The coaches are on different teams now. It is an operational business. Right. And so that's how you have to cover it. But if you're working for a local team, yeah, Jerome talking about doing something with the Texans. He's got to cover the Texans in and out, and you got to shoot it straight to the people who pay their money, either through cable television subscriptions or to buy tickets, who follow the Houston Texans. And even if the stories are ugly, you're finding out what's going on with a very dysfunctional franchise. I mean, that's just part of it. But in terms of watching sports as a whole, you better believe I'm watching Wimbledon, or you better believe, I'm watching the NBA Finals. But in terms of rooting interest, very hard to have.
The thing I think you left out of there, though, Steve, you show up at a stadium. I mean, you're there during the week doing some other stuff, but when the game is on Sunday, you're there for a football game. You don't care who wins or loses.
Nope.
But you're going to marvel at the excellence that you see. You
Absolutely.
love for a quarterback to throw for 500 yards or a running back to run for 250. You don't care which running back, who he is, because you're rooting for the story. You're rooting for the drama, and you're watching something. You don't know what you're going to see, so you're excited. And you're excited for big games when the two teams are well regarded. You're like, this is going to be good, and I'm going to be right here.
And I'm here for it.
I'm standing here on the sideline up close watching this. You don't care who wins. You're like, I'm doing good right now. And that's a sports fan. A sports fan loves great sports, and we're huge sports fans. We don't have a rooting interest.
Right.
Understandable there. The next cue is a lot of sports fans think they have what it takes to do what you do. How is talking about sports on the air different from talking about sports at home?
Can I start this, Jerome?
You can take that one.
Please do.
Look, a lot of them can. In terms of, and when I say this, Jerome referenced some sports talk radio shows. A lot of those guys just sit there and they just chat water cooler stuff, right? There are people who can just talk, right? But you can't do what I do right out of the gate, right? First off, the waiting and everything we have to do. If you have that Colin Kaepernick story that I had to write, I had to organize thoughts, outline them. It was a written story. So I had to draw back on my print background, organize thoughts, and understand the impact of the story I wanted to tell. Not everybody can do that. Some people can write beautiful prose, but to organize your thoughts and to have the impact and how it impacts the people reading that or watching that is a skill. The biggest example I can give is there's a lot of great athletes who are great interviews, right? They are great talkers. Peyton Manning's a great interview, just one of the best ever. But to get behind a microphone and to fill space or to talk with expertise is much harder when you've got to tell your story in 30 seconds or something like that. So it is a skill. Plus, we've got access, as Jerome was just talking about. Jerome can get to a coach or he can get to players. Yeah, you may DM them. They don't know you from Adam, right? So that's another part of the skill, and that's an opportunity you have to get in. But there's a lot of training and experience, and there's also stuff off the street. You may have a rooting interest, right? Mm-hmm. So you may overlook something that's far more key and far more knowledgeable that we've been tracing all week in preparation for this that shows its head that you don't necessarily notice.
Like Steve said, the specific skills are just off the charts. And like when Steve's on TV and they go to him, you don't know what he's hearing in his ear about, hey, I need 45 seconds, kill it, go. And so you're talking, answering a question or giving some information and somebody else is telling you to do something else at the same time. That's a challenge. But the point you brought up about not everybody knows how to interview people. Not everybody can talk to a coach or whatever. And I know this has happened to Steve without even asking him. I guarantee I know his ability and his intelligence and his sports knowledge. I know it's happened to him where coaches have their own little world they live in. It's a fascinating world. I love it. They call you coach. Because there's when they're having a conversation with them, I look, coach, and you're like, I'm not a coach. I never coach.
No,
but
not that guy.
That tells you they respect you. You know what I mean? Like they respect your knowledge and they're talking to you like they're talking to somebody else who knows the game. And when you hear that, you're like, yeah, see, he's I'm a guy. I'm one of the guys. I'm in the mix. And you can't get that off the street. You can't get that. You can watch people on TV and you go, oh, I can do that. No. I can yell like Stephen A. No. You can yell.
No, you can't.
You can't drop Stephen A. You know what I mean?
No.
It doesn't work that way. I was gonna say it might look easy. To me, it doesn't even look easy. It goes when I see these guys do what they do, I know that's not easy because I do it. And people go, man, you look like you're comfortable and having fun and you're presenting the shows on TV that you do. Like, yeah, I am, but I've got a lot of other people who I put on my shows and I see them and they look like a hostage. And I know they're not comfortable doing it. And I don't know why I am. I'm not acting like I'm the greatest or anything, but it's not nearly as easy as some of us look. Yeah.
Mm-mm.
For sure. How have you seen the coverage of sports change in light of the Me Too movement or the current coverage of Deshaun Watson?
Man, that's a tough one. In that that's a tough one. There are a lot of layers to that. I think there was a time where, and this is not about sports to me, and so when people say, and they put it in the lawsuits, each one of the lawsuits has a line. And I'm not going to give you the exact wording right now because I don't have it in front of me, but there's a line in each lawsuit that says the NFL harbors or promotes, but promotes, a sexual harassment environment. Like they're blaming the NFL for what Deshaun Watson has done. And in all of these cases, whether it's, a domestic violence situation, drug situation, DWI situation, or Deshaun Watson situation, I tell people there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people arrested for that last night. They weren't in the NFL. It's not about sports. They were lawyers, doctors, plumbers, yard men, accountants, all across the board in all kinds of professions, unemployed, who were arrested for these types of things. When not the Deshaun thing, he hadn't been arrested for it or charged or anything. But when a case comes up and people go, that's what the NFL guys do. Like, no, they don't. Everybody does, or people do that. And so I start with that I take the incidents away from sports because most of them are not sports related, So now in the Me Too movement, specifically what the question was, I don't know if it's more challenging because you're always supposed to be fair. You're always supposed to pay attention to what else is around. I think journalists before our era of journalists maybe didn't, because the world did, because that's the America that we grew up in. That that's why there needed to be a Me Too movement, because women didn't get treated properly in these kind of situations. They do now, but it's not about sports. It's about, that's the way it ought to be and should have always been.
And sports coverage has changed. I mean, let's not make any bones about it. And the Ray Rice videotape from years ago was the game changer, where he punched his girlfriend on video. We heard the story, he smacked his fiance, or I think it was fiance at the time. He smacked her, so people were like, okay, let's see how this plays out. Then you see a video of the strong football player punching his wife in an elevator, and she's out like a sack of hammers, right? So they're like, oh, okay, that's the game changer. That's when the awareness of everybody who saw that from a supposed good guy said, we can't have this stuff. We cannot have these guys going around hitting women. Remember, his original suspension was 2 games, and all of a sudden they gave him 6 to all of a sudden to a season, right? So, and he's never played again. So that's when, especially in light of the Deshaun Watson situation and other things, it has taken on a completely different sensitivity. Like with Deshaun Watson, the difference is these are civil charges. And Jerome and I, in our careers, and I've been doing this for more than 30 years, Jerome is right there with me, right? We have gotten all kinds of letters and emails and things from women and men who are accusing these guys of things that don't turn out to be true, whatever. I'm not saying this isn't true, but we have really got to tread lightly on this. And for Deshaun Watson being a quarterback, everything is elevated when you are an NFL quarterback. Nothing. Colin Kaepernick, had it been an outside linebacker who did that, nobody would have really cared as much as the fact that Colin Kaepernick was an NFL quarterback.
Quite a few other players have knelt during the anthem, and
correct. But really, I think in terms of social sensitivity to women's issues, to sexual abuse, that all relates to all of us, right? I came from a mother. I've got a sister. No, so now we are able to, as men especially, have a heightened awareness to this, especially with so many of our female colleagues and things like this in our workplaces, instituting a lot more sensitivity rules and things you can and cannot say that are acceptable and not acceptable. That goes to the coverage. And
that's why I think it's not a change. It's a change, but the world changed. Right? It's evolution. Yes. That's exactly what it put it. Because man, I read archive stuff all the time, and I'll go back and read stories about what an athlete did or a situation that happened, and it was a minor note in the back of a newspaper. It wasn't the front page story. It wasn't the front of the sports section, and it wasn't discussed outside of whatever town that athlete played in.
Right.
Whereas now, anytime something happens, anytime an athlete does something, we're all talking about it. Doesn't matter where he played, where he is, and that's a huge difference. And that's because of the awareness. We pay more attention to it, and it's unacceptable. I just really wish it was always unacceptable, but it wasn't always unacceptable. My first column about the Deshaun Watson thing, I said, I'm not going to go into the details of what's been alleged because it's just been alleged. I'm not going to go there, but I'm not going to, push it off to the side either. The boys will be boys thing was the approach that journalists taken in sports for probably 100 years. We're not doing the boys will be boys thing anymore.
Well said.
Very well said. When speaking about covering players, do you ever feel pressure to censor yourself to avoid offending a player you like?
Steve likes a lot more players than I do.
No. Yeah, I mean,
I'm kidding. Yeah,
yeah. I won't say this. No. I mean, if a guy messes up, he's going to mess up. If a guy does something, you have to talk about it. You have to report it. Years ago, when I used to cover the NBA and the Miami Heat, great guard, all-star guard Tim Hardaway told me one time, at least just let us know it's coming. We know we're not perfect. We know when we mess up, it's going to happen. So I see some reporters censor themselves for sources, right? Players who talk to them, coaches who talk to them, general managers who talk to them. They will not come down on those people for their failures or shortcomings because they want to
guys like us. Oh, okay.
Yeah, especially black reporters. We notice this because it's typically the white reporters who get fed. And so a lot of these guys don't want to cut off the valve. And so they will look past poor drafts. They will look past, a player doing this or that. Now, journalistically, to me, I censor myself in if it doesn't add anything to the value of the report, then why does it need to be in there? Like, why do I need to say like such and such did this? And that was a result of it. I mean, if it doesn't add to it, and that's a lot of times reporters who try to get that edge, they will put in what I consider minutia, things that don't add to the value of the story. Now, that's subjective. It may add to the value of the story to them. Mm-hmm. But I am always thinking of what I said when I first got on here, the IQ of the sports fan. does that really matter to the guy sitting in the sports bar, to the guy who's gambling on the game, to the guy who grew up a diehard University of Houston Cougars basketball? Yeah. Does that part really matter? And that's where the censorship comes. But in terms of feelings, nope.
You got to deal with it.
Nope.
Yeah,
we all deal with it.
I'm a sports fan, right? But I'm a fan of athletes and greatness and what they do and how hard they work and what they present. Because as I've said many times, I go to the games to watch the players play. I don't go to games to watch the owner own or the general manager generally manage. I go to watch the players play. So I'm there for that excitement. But if the players play poorly, they just got to deal with it. And we mentioned credibility earlier. Players are not going to respect you if you're not going to give them the real. But, you know, I'm going to take cheap shots at them from a distance. No, I'm going to say what it is, and they'll see me the next day. And I've had many times where do like, oh, you were killing me yesterday. Like, well, bro, you threw 3 interceptions. What do you expect me to do? And usually most times it's not even a big deal. And there has been times, one specifically I can point to, where I thought I went too far. You know, like Sage Rosenfels was a quarterback for the Texans, and you know he was a backup. He hadn't played much, and he got in the game, and he was just killing the Colts, dominating the game. Texans gonna win, up 17 late in the game, and he turned the ball over a couple times and did this wild flying. Just dropped the ball, right? And they lost the game. Well, I couldn't let it go. Weeks later, I was still bringing that play up, and it upset him, and he wanted to talk, and he got me over to the side. And he's like, "Dude, my mom and dad are reading this, and you're still taking shots." And I was like, "Yeah, because it's funny. You're terrible." But as we discussed it, and I came to him, I actually told him, I was like, you know what, you're kind of right, because the one today had nothing to do with the story I was writing about. I just threw it in there, you know, and I did say, to defend myself, I was like, well, that's the last thing you did, but he hadn't played, so why am I still bringing up that play from way back then, except to take a cheap shot? And he and I are really cool now, like friends now. But we had that discussion where I had to admit, you know what, I did that. And it wasn't about I didn't like him or I wouldn't be applauding him if I liked him and left it out. It was unfair on a certain level because it was just unnecessary, as Steve said, with what I was working on. Did that point mean anything to the column I was writing? No, it did. It was hilarious. Don't get me wrong, but it was cheap. But you learn from that. So no, I've known many coaches a long time. Kelvin Sampson, the head coach at U of H. I covered him 25 years ago when he was at Oklahoma in colleges. Know him really well. And I get texts from coaches all the time like, dude, you're killing me. Or from general managers like, that was hilarious, but you're wrong. You're killing me. But it was funny. So they respect it because they know you're going to also applaud when they deserve that too.
All right. I'm curious to hear y'all's perspective with the next question. How have new developments like fantasy sports and esports impacted sports journalism?
Huge. It's huge because, look, the majority of viewers, you know, and I'll just say this, like NFL Network during the week, we have all this great news and all these great broadcasts. But our highest rated shows are fantasy shows, right? Because there's so many people who may not be the diehard fan, but because they've got all these star players in their fantasy team and all of a sudden they're winning their office pool, they're like, oh, let me start paying attention. So there's a lot more discussion about it. Now, esports is still kind of a fringe outlier where you've got a lot of the gamers who pay attention to it. It really hasn't crossed into the mainstream yet. You know, we're showing shows on TNT and things like that with these big arenas full of watching people play these fighter games and these teams do all this stuff. The NBA has invested. There's like a 20-team esports NBA league, so they understand the rise of it, but that's still kind of a niche deal. That's not part of the overall sports conversation. But fantasy sports, 100%, because it's something that's all inclusive. Anybody can play it, young, old. All my kids are in all these fantasy leagues. So that's really hyped a lot more of the conversation. There's a lot more of the dialogue centered around statistics and numbers in certain conversations because of the fantasy element of things.
Yeah, the fantasy element of things, as Steve says, that's why we got the question a few minutes ago about people saying, they can do it better than us, because the fantasy people believe they can run a team better than the general managers who are running teams, but they're much more knowledgeable than they've ever been. I mean, there was a time when, especially when I first started, certainly when Steve first started, where he knew more about whatever he was covering than anybody, and now they're just regular people who know who the fourth best receiver is on any random team somewhere,
right?
Guys I've never heard of. Because if you're not in fantasy, you don't know this guy or what his stats are. They know stats, they know players, they know the league in a fantasy level way better than most of us who are entrenched with just the stars or the top level or the team that we cover. So it has changed how we present what we put out there as well. I mean, you go back and read some of the old newspapers, for instance, they weren't talking about some third wide receiver on a team in the middle of nowhere. I mean, passing has changed too, but now people want to hear about many more players than they ever did, because more people know more players. And I think it's made a significant difference in the female audience as well. I mean,
100%.
We're talking about women who are intelligent and know the sport as well as anybody would know it. And part of it is because they've been able to find an avenue into the game without having played it, just by being a fantasy league owner. And it has made the sports audience smarter about what they're doing. And the smarter the audience is, the higher level we have to produce to impress them.
For sure. With that being our last question, part of the Q&A, I do want to formally thank you two gentlemen for being here and providing great answers and great insight. And as if there's anything else either one of y'all would like to add, any closing comments or any advice?
Well, I'll go first since I was the last one to get in. Opportunities like this are always valuable to me, I think, in that, a lot of people helped me along the way, taught me things, showed me things. And the most important part of that was they were willing to show and to teach, but I was also willing to listen and learn. And I had a conversation with a young man, who talks anymore, a text conversation here over the weekend with a young journalist who's trying to make his way in the business. And he'd reached out to another friend of mine, Clarence Hill in Fort Worth. And one of the things that I was like, and this kid's in my city. I'm like, you're here in my city and you haven't reached out to me. And you want to do exactly what I do. And I'm like, you need to do that. I'm not one of those people who reach out to strangers and reach for a lot of help either. So everybody has their own individual personality. But boy, if you want to make it in this business, you want to do what we do, then you need to follow the people that do what you want to do. You need to listen to the best, watch the best, read from the best. And trust me, you'd be surprised at how many of them are open to help you out. It's competitive, but that competition isn't about stomping on people who are not in the business yet. That's not how the competition works. There's so many people who want to give, who want to help you out. And yeah, we get busy. There are times you might go, oh, I thought this guy would talk to me and he hadn't talked to me. And I'd send him a message and I hadn't heard from him. But you'd be shocked at how many times we'll spend hours working with you on something. If you catch it at the right time, don't be afraid to ask.
And Jerome, and look, especially among Black journalists, it is so united across the board here to uplift. Like we're confident enough of what we do. We're not threatened by someone reaching out for a hand, because we know we need more Black journalists and more Black producers. And what Jerome is getting into ownership, right? We need more shot callers. So anything we can do to help, we're there. Like I said, you've got Jerome will give you his Twitter and his email. You know, I've given you my information. So reach out. I mean, it's something that we do. Couple other quick notes. Don't be having no smoking blunts, drinking beers, any of this stuff on your damn social media. People follow that. I'm telling you right now, one of the first things you find in a job application are give us your social media handles. They will find your stuff, okay? People are screenshotting it. Do not handicap yourself out of the gate by doing stuff and stupid stuff and advertising it, okay? So those are a few pointers right there. And also understand that anything you want, there's at least 1,000 other people who want it. Keep that in mind every time. What are you going to do to distinguish yourself from that other person, whether it's making connection with me and Jerome, who can vouch for you, or if it is presenting things differently, or being able to write with just an absolute gift of being simple thing like organizing the first 5 paragraphs of a story. That's a difficult thing to do. It takes a long time to do it. But if you are able to get that skill down, that is hugely important. But it is a real.
And these particular skills that we're talking about, or we mentioned, in passing here during this conversation, these skills these are not things that are unattainable. You can literally watch Steve on TV 5-6 times a week and learn how to do what he does. Like you can read what I write and go, well, if I follow that model, then I know I'm writing something good. And I'm not even I'm using us because we're here, but look at the best. Look at what people do and do that. You gotta be yourself. You gotta be inventive. You're gonna create. You gotta be better than everyone else. We know that. And with you there.
And don't necessarily just listen to what we say or read what we read, but look how we do it. That's an important part. So I've never had a television lesson in my life, okay? But I watch Anderson Cooper of CNN. He is my journalistic muse because he can host a show. He can he can moderate a political panel. He can be in Haiti 2 days later after an earthquake, okay? And then he can come back and host a New Year's Eve show, right? The versatility, the different approaches he takes. I'm not always listening to what he says, but how he presents in the field as opposed to a studio, as opposed to doing a one-on-one, as opposed to moderating an 8-person panel. That is, again, just learning by watching, following, reading is important. And folks, nothing that you do in this field is more important than knowing how to write. You have to know how to write.
It all starts it up. If you're not telling a story, why does anyone want to watch you do what you do? And believe me, there are many different ways of doing this, especially on the broadcast. Steve is a pro. He's smooth. He's professional. He has a look. He always has that look. He's gonna do what he does. He ain't gonna dance. He ain't gonna sing. That's not him. If you want to dance and sing, you can do that, but make sure you're doing it with the best writing and storytelling that goes with it. You're not just there for a show. You're there to provide information, and of course, you got to entertain if you want to be an entertainer in an entertainment business. But I'm much more entertained when somebody tells me something that's important than I am if they're just being crazy. And trust me, there are plenty of people who just be crazy, and they can succeed in this business. That's harder to do. it's a little more challenging.
It's not what we do.
It's not what we do at all. And there's no right or wrong or better, but trust me, most of those people, to be fair to them, they know how to do what we do too. They just also have a whole lot more other stuff happening with them. You can't jump to them without starting with the basics and really writing clearly, concisely, reporting, talking to people, learning how to interview. Interviewing is a challenge, and I know that Steve, I'm sure you had to deal with it the same as I did. A interview for a story or writing, for journalism, for a newspaper, completely different interview than for TV.
Yep.
A whole different world. you got to learn the differences. You got to put in the time to work on that, because interviewing is a learned skill. But I'm telling you, I get so often now where at the end of the interview, the subject will go, man, and nobody asked me that question before. Oh, wow. How'd you know that? So I did a lot of work before I sat down with it.
That's when you know you got a good one. That's when you know you did it well.
Sure, for sure. Great answers. Thank you guys again for your time here. Truly appreciate the great insight and answers. I don't even know what else much to say. This has been a classic conversation. But thank you guys again. And and here's Mr. Blackwell coming up now.
Yes, just to echo what Irie has said, thank you to our panelists, Jerome Solomon and Steve Wyche, for just so many important tips and insights into the field of sports journalism. I know that our audience benefited greatly from this and are deeply appreciative that you were willing to give your time to be here. Just a lot of good advice here. We talked about the importance of storytelling in sports journalism, and that's something that people don't always recognize that that's what the kind of key is to quality sports journalism. We talked about how, to some, this is much harder than it looks, that it may look like fun, may look like kind of casual, off the cuff type stuff, but there's real work that goes into doing this well. We heard that we got to study the best if we want to be able to do this at a high level. And one of the things that really stood out to me, if I'm a student, is don't be afraid to reach out to people. Both of our panelists said this in their own way, and I think that it's important that you heed that advice if you're somebody who wants to do this for a living. Be willing to listen, be willing to learn. Yesterday afternoon, we heard that, being a college student, one of the benefits of it is you'll never be in an environment where there are so many opportunities coming to your doorstep, essentially, as there are when you're on a college campus. And so we want you to take advantage of that. And speaking of that, we've got more opportunities coming tomorrow. So tomorrow morning at 10:30, our first session is actually called A World of Opportunities. It's about careers in public media. So we're going to have a large panel tomorrow morning of public radio and public television personnel. The moderator for that session is going to be Mr. John Hughes, who's the general manager of KPVU FM, which is the on-campus radio station. So we encourage you to be there for that session. And then tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m., our session is called Balancing Between Worlds, Versatility in Media Careers. It's going to be a one-on-one conversation between me and Mr. Marcus Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan is an on-air personality in radio. He's the morning show host for 91.7 NGen Radio here in the Houston area. He's also the owner and founder of his own online radio platform, Blessed Beats, and he happens to also be a freelance reporter for TMZ. So we'll talk about what it's like to kind of operate in these different arenas as an entrepreneur, as an on-air personality for an established station, and then as a freelancer for a big company like TMZ. Should be a pretty good conversation. So once again, we want you to be here. pvmutv.org/COMM week is where you can find all of our sessions. Go back and rewatch the stuff from earlier in the week and just continue to stay tuned. We got 2 more days. Take care.